But anyway, let's start our discussion. So as you all know, the project Learn to Lead, it's based on the Sikh principles of seva and bandh shako. So that's the underlying principle for it, is that normally we think of doing things like langar seva and other financial ways of doing seva, and this is another way of doing seva. It's utilizing our skills, sharing our ideas, sharing our knowledge, and also at the same time refining our skills in leadership and focusing on the core essence of it being learning. Because in my view, when in leadership we stop learning, then at that point we start to stagnate. So it's about this continuous learning and continuous reflection and continuous creation of culture, because the stronger our culture is, I think that has a positive impact in all sorts of ways in our professional and in our personal lives. And I've spoken to each one of you about stories that influence you, stories that empower you to behave in a more professional way, in a way that has brought you more success. So if I could start again with Josh, because I can see you on the screen first. Josh, tell me about stories, Sikh stories that you've heard from your grandparents, from your parents, that have empowered you.
Yes, well, just with my grandparents coming into the UK in the 1940s, and stayed in a Christian church, in a homeless church, for 7 years, and it inspires myself. One being lucky to be born British in the UK, and secondly, how my grandparents have worked themselves up, and being self-employed, and helping our Sikh community quite a lot in Edinburgh. So yes, it's really it's empowered me to follow their footsteps.
And so based on your grandparents' experience, you've talked a little bit about that with me before. What would you say is like the core message that you, or the value that you've held dearly, that has kept you in good stead?
I think what is with Guru Nanak's saying one shako, kirat, kamao, japo. So I think that's the main 3 words that's kind of kept me in the right path in terms of working life, having a business, is giving back. It's about becoming successful or having good things in life, but it's also giving back as well, because like they say, once you give something to charity or help others who are in need, Vaheguru gives you double, triple back more. So I think that's always kept in my mind.
And it's quite, those principles, they're so deep, and yet they're quite, there's nothing, you don't have to be a scholar to understand those 3 principles. So that's part of the beauty of it, isn't it? The simplicity. Okay. All right, let me go to Harji. How about you, Harji? What does Sikh mean to you, and how does it empower your life?
So I think there are a number of values that I've taken from Sikh as I was growing up. I think you touched on a few of these during our last session. The first was compassion, expressed when I'm leading others on teams, displaying empathy, understanding and knowing people beyond the role that they play on that group, and just getting to know people, as on an individual basis, when they need someone to listen, right? That's definitely something I picked up from Sikh. I think the second value would probably be just general confidence, right? Expressed in the workplace physically, right? Through my clothes, my appearance. Obviously, I stick out, right? Just like many Sikh men and women. And then mentally, right? Through my knowledge and experience. And then I built on that foundation over time, right? By recognizing and focusing on my desires and needs, in addition to those that I was taught through Sikh. And then I think the last one is creativity, right? And this kind of touches on Punjabi culture. I express it through Bhangra. So I lead and advise several teams. And that creativity may come in the form of choreography, set design, Bandhi design, music selection, whatever it may be. But I know I was exposed to that through my Punjabi community, and so that was another value that I picked up, and that I admire seeing in other people as well.
And how important do you think that symbology is? For example, you wear the bag and you don't necessarily want to be identified as a Sikh, but more as a Punjabi rather than a Sikh, and yet you still wear the bag. How important is the symbology for you in terms of identity?
So I think, as I grew up, I think the symbology changed a little bit. So when I was young, it was definitely representative of Sikh values, and I think those still hold, right? The values that Josh touched on, right? That we're here to help others. That's so important to me, and that comes through in the career that I've chosen in healthcare, and the importance I place on making that a large part of my life. Now, although I wouldn't certainly, want people to unnecessarily identify me as a Sikh, I don't mind going out of my way to talk about Sikhi, and because I have learned history, I grew up in a Sikh family, and so I'm happy to explain those values, and I express them anyways, regardless of whether I identify with the term or not.
That's right, because values are values, aren't they? Values don't have any borders, really.
Right.
They're not confined to Sikhi. The values that you hold dear, compassion is also important in other religions. In every religion that I can think of, compassion is important. And so if you are motivated through that value of being compassionate, it doesn't really matter what religion it is, because you're expressing your compassion.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. And let me go to Baljinder now then. So Baljinder, tell me about, you can either comment on what Harji and Josh have said previously, or tell us about your take on the power of stories in influencing our behavior.
Yeah, sure. I think specifically for me, coming from a legal background, I think the idea and the story of Bandhi Chor is quite powerful for me and a lot of other people. So the sixth guru, who was falsely imprisoned, who eventually helped 50 other people come out of prison, and that idea of liberation and helping others regardless of their background. I think that story is quite powerful for me. And I think it's quite important for anyone in any religion or culture as well to help others. And I think that's kind of one story that stuck out for me in terms of Sikhi. And I think intertwined with that is things like seva, selfless service, and the idea of langar as well, which I personally, growing up, I've seen it, go beyond just the langar hall. It's helping everyone regardless, whether it's mentoring, charitable initiatives, whatever. So there's a number of very key concepts that I kind of take with me in my day-to-day life and my professional life as well. But Bandhi Chor is a very big one that kind of like stuck out for me in recent years, particularly.
That's a very powerful story, because it's very symbolic, isn't it? Because those people that were saved, holding on to the tailcoat, basically, they weren't necessarily Sikh. So it's like the unconditional, the altruistic generosity, wasn't it, of like helping, not wanting. He could have simply said, yes, free me, but he chose to have all these other people tag along to their freedom.
Exactly. I think it's more important in recent times because we've all been in lockdown as well. So the idea of imprisonment and not being able to leave, but stopping that from happening just to help others is, that connection was there for me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Shuranjit, comments on what people have said already and your own stories.
Yeah, so I think for me, the kind of fundamental beginning of the time Guru Nanak Dev Ji spent at the beginning of their lives and within their subsequent lives as a spark of revolution, essentially. You're looking at social hierarchies, you're questioning the way society does things, and you're trying to turn that on its head because it doesn't work for everyone. There are people who hold on to power. There are people who keep power from others. There are people who will push others to the bottom and try and stay at the top. And so for me, understanding that spark of revolution is absolutely fundamental in my relationship with Sikhi. And so when we're thinking about this in relation to gender, in relation to caste, looking at it in our current context, in relation to race, in relation to sexual orientation, there are so many different hierarchies in our society that push people down to the bottom. And so I'm really, really quite, always consistently inspired by how the very beginning, the very spark of Sikhi was to challenge power, and was to challenge power not just for the sake of it, but to ensure that everybody has the opportunities and the abilities to be able to live life how they want to without being restricted in different kinds of ways. And so when you've got that, you've got that beginning, which is a spark, which is a way of doing things differently, which is questioning, and as Harji mentioned, being creative as well. I think two things inspire me the most within that, and the first is miri biri, so the concept of kind of bringing through the temporal, so the things that are happening around us, and the spiritual, and so not only just reflecting for the sake of reflecting or acting for the sake of acting, but finding a balance between action and reflection. We're not just out there in the world engaging with no thought about how we're doing it. We're reflecting on how we engage. We're using our relationship to Sikhi, our relationship to other things as a compass, as an alignment, as a framework for evaluating how we're living our lives. And then with those evaluations, we're actually putting things into practice. And so we're not just reflecting for the sake of it. We're not just reflecting and pushing ourselves away. We're not just going and, existing outside of society. It's fundamentally, for me, about action and reflection within society itself. And then when it comes to a Saki or a figure in Sikh, a figure in Sikh histories, I think the kind of story of Bhai Ghanaya Ji, when they offered sustenance and aid to people who had been kind of wounded in what would probably be seen as the enemy armies within kind of Sikh histories. And for me, that shows us that our compassion is is boundless. Our compassion is for all, but also our compassion is rooted in that work towards social justice and that work towards change. Our compassion doesn't mean that we can be stepped on, but our compassion means that we do things differently, and we engage with people differently. And for me, when we're thinking about this, for me, it's entirely related to social justice. It's something that is, it's very difficult to kind of not see the two related in that way. And so when we're thinking about, working with those who might be oppressed in society, standing with people who might be oppressed, but it's also showing some kind of radical compassion to the people who are doing the oppressing, because they're all outputs of the same system. It's all outputs of people who've been kind of molded or kind of socialized into certain types of behaviors. And so having that lens and that approach, that internal and external reflection and action is what kind of I see and I engage with through my relationship with Sikhi.
Yes, you've touched on some very important points. This whole issue about being compassionate unconditionally, that we're not only being compassionate to those we like or those who agree with us, we're not only being compassionate to those who follow the same path in life, but we're compassionate also to those who are on face value are enemies, because Sikhi teaches us nirvair, right? Like being without enmity. That's one of the things that we have to strive towards, is thinking about the concept of oneness where there are no enemies. And so it's compassion together with courage, because as you say, for social justice, sometimes we can't simply be compassionate, we have to be courageous as well. And when I think sometimes people go off track when they are only being courageous and not being compassionate, because courage without compassion can also be just as oppressive, right? There are lots of cases where people are very courageous, but there's, they speak the truth or they follow the truth, but there is a lack of kindness in the truth that they tell.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also finding that balance. You know, we see the world becoming more and more polarized in the last, 10 to 15 years. And that polarization doesn't lend itself to compassion. It doesn't lend itself to people trying to engage with the kind of humanity of others at the center. So whilst we are, we really, really kind of value that level of courageousness, our compassion isn't something that lets us be kind of stepped on. But the compassion is what sets us apart from how things are happening at the moment.
Okay. And Parminder, what about you? What do you think about this whole issue of courage, compassion, creativity, confidence, all of these values that we hold dearly? Do you think that, we need to integrate those values, or is it, or do we need to think of those values in isolation? What do you think?
Carrying on from Sharanjit's points of Midi-Piri, this whole, growing up, there was this big push about Sikhs being a martial race. This big push that we are these warriors. But we forget that actually we were Sant Sapais. So we were saintly soldiers. We were people who looked at compassion, interlinked with our bravery, our courageousness. We what you said just about being kind, even at times when we're telling our truths. It's growing up. It was always it was trying to find a fine balance between these radical movements of young Sikh guys who are saying, "Oh, we have to defend our community, we have to defend our purpose," as compared to saying, "Oh, hold on, Bonnie and all the history says actually we need to be kind, we need compassion, we have to recognize that not everyone's the same, and we have to recognize that we're all, and I use this term equal loosely because I think there's an element of equity. It's not just equality, it has to be a balance of equity with it. And then growing up hearing what my great grandmother, my pradadi, did in helping the community, because my pradada was a soldier in the British Army. He fought in battles in Italy and various other, and he brought back wealth to the village. And then my pradadi used that wealth to marry off so many people and help them in their times of need. That even today, I walk into weddings or family functions or just random functions, and I mention whose great grandson I am. And that drive of recognition that says, okay, we have to be selfless, we have to be individuals who are recognizing the gaps in society and trying to, not necessarily fill them, but how we address them to ensure that everyone in society is supported, stands very core to me. And at the same time, I think historically, we forget the peripheral stories, beyond the gurus. Yes, we had Das Guru, but we had so many other actors involved in our journey, and of different faiths, all presenting the similar traits of our gurus. It's and it's not to say, it's like sometimes I look at the different world religions and I think it's like a Premiership league and football. Who's at the top of the table, who's at the top of the league. What we forget, it's a continuum. We forget that one built on the other. And there are so many similarities, but we're on a learning curve. And instead of recognizing the learning, we're constantly comparing and saying which is better. Yes, that's it.
Okay, all right. Ravinder, there's someone watching football behind you. Now we can't hear you. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, I'm in the family home. They're watching football in the background.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Karanjit now. Karanjit, if you could just tell everyone where you're based, first of all, and tell us about your take on the impact of Sikhi stories on our behavior.
So first, apologies for being late. I was trying to get my toddler to sleep. So I'm based in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. I'm a family physician with a interest and specialty in addiction medicine. So I primarily work with the Punjabi community of Winnipeg or Manitoba to get Punjabis connected to resources for their addictions or substance use, whatever substance it is. And it's really my passion to support these individuals as they struggle with their substance use, because I think it's a real struggle for Punjabi people. What was the second part, Jasveer?
Yeah, well, thinking about your work, working with those who are addicted, in what way do you think that their addiction is related to their loss of identity in some way? Like, is it, you know, is there a link between self-esteem, identity, and our predisposition to being vulnerable to becoming addicted because we don't have a very strong sense of who we are?
Yeah, so I think, I think this overlaps a lot with some of the themes that I've just heard briefly now, but also in general with, as Parminder just said, Sikhs have such a, if you look at just the effects of colonialism on Sikhism and just in general, what Sikhs have gone through over the last however many years, if I look at a timeline, it's just the resilience of our people, but also the effect it's had on them. So then you've got these courageous, resilient warrior people, and then you have the effects of how they're supposed to deal with what's happened to them over and over and over. And somewhere along the ways, and I mean, history shows it, but these individuals have that coping ability, that ability to tolerate stress or whatever is in their lives has changed, and not for the better necessarily. And I think turning to substances, the work I do started in Punjab. So if I look at the region of Punjab and how much struggle that region has with substance use issues, and how normalized some substances are, like daru and feem, then that combined with what's happened to that population, it's not surprising that they're doing what they're doing. And so how do you help them cope with that based on their values, which are so, we're taught to be so resilient and so strong, and mental health is not a large focus for us. And so you can't tell a 45-year-old Punjabi, male that you have, a mind that requires support and love and nourishment, because he's so focused on everything else he has to do for his family, for everybody else but himself. And there's lots and lots of tangents here on the issue, but I don't think it's surprising that based on history, we're seeing the struggle in our people today, especially when it relates to substance use, which is my area of interest. And I'm now starting to understand what impact history has had on these individuals.
Yes, because the Sikh community has suffered grave traumas in recent decades.
Yes, very much so.
So how do you think stories can enable this, like if identities have been diluted and distorted, how can stories be used to rebuild the identity, to rebuild the self-esteem?
For me, the biggest thing is reducing the stigma associated with substance use. I spend a lot of time trying to get the patient in the door. I don't have a hard time getting the family in the door because the family's desperate. I have a hard time getting the patient in the door. And so for me, the biggest thing is reducing the stigma associated with substance use and making it a real thing that we can talk about. The most amazing conversations I have are when I've got a whole family in there with the primary problem, and just being able to dialogue about what we can do to support this person who's really truly struggling, And it's amazing how the family doesn't even see that as a real struggle, right? It's not even really a disease. It's sort of considered to be in their heads. But that's not truly actually how addiction works, if you understand the physiology of the brain and what the body goes through. And so for me, it's about reducing the stigma and helping these people rebuild their lives with their families. Because I don't think the disease just affects the person, it affects the whole family. So I call it a family disease, family trauma. And helping them rebuild that is part of rebuilding that self-esteem and helping them reintegrate into society. So I actually you know, sometimes it's hard because you sort of say to them, this may have happened for a reason, you know, maybe it's, how can we put a positive spin on this so that you can try to come out of this, you know, because otherwise it's a very, it's a real hit to the soul to have to experience such kind of lack of control, you know, they feel like they have no control in their lives because they are a victim to that substance, right? So it's about building that story up again, that self-esteem up, and getting rid of the shame. I think that's the biggest piece for me. The most rewarding piece, yet the most challenging piece.
Okay, let me ask Harji your views on this because of your interest in Bhangra, and I know that Bhangra is one of the things that it's life enhancing. You know, when people take care of their physical well-being through joyous things like that. What's in your experience when people do Bhangra? Do you ever come across people who are depressed or are addicted to substances, for example?
Yeah, so I'd say substance abuse, I think, well, at least in the US, Bhangra is mostly seen in the college circuit. And so because of that, there's general substance abuse that we see amongst students in, regularly. And so, yes, those issues certainly exist. I don't think Bhangra necessarily, at least in the US, is a way to remove oneself from that situation. I think it may actually exacerbate the issue if it was an issue before they began dancing. I don't think the community values there aren't in a direction that would, necessarily support weaning off of those substance abuse support systems, right? However, on the other hand, with other mental health issues, such as, depression and anxiety, I've certainly seen a strong jump in mental health, robust mental health. I think a lot of people use it as an outlet to, get rid of their stress, whether that may be school or family or friends. And it becomes a great opportunity to meet new people, socialize, travel, learn new things, express oneself in a way that you may not have access to early on in life, right? I think many people in our community tend to come from very conservative backgrounds. And so Bhangra is just a method of them trying to find themselves. And I think that, Karanjit, you can speak to this a little bit better than I can. I'm just speaking from, anecdotal evidence that I've seen. But it seems to have a very positive effect. And I can speak from personal experience. It's helped me get out of a number of difficult situations over the past decade.
Yeah, the reason I brought you in there, Harji, is because from the stories that I've heard, there seems to be a tendency to think about martyrdom, and like Karanjit was explaining, like they have a lot of burdens, responsibilities, and there just doesn't seem to be a balance between what they have to do altruistically for others and balancing that with taking good care of themselves. And that can tilt towards, depression and substance abuse. Karanjit, what would you say?
Oh, absolutely. I think, the biggest question I ask most of my clientele are Punjabi Sikh men, right? So, and the biggest question when I ask in my intake is, what do you do for yourself? What's your self-care routine? And there's no answer, there's no concept, right? So is it exercise? Is it path? Meditation? Get to see, what do you do to kind of nourish your soul? And I have yet to have an individual who's been able to. It's like I am like an alien, They don't even get the concept. And it's really interesting because teaching the concept is where the work is and where they thrive over time. Because in the beginning, it's just about stability and getting them their basic life back, their driver's licenses, their families, if they're estranged, right? It's about just fixing the bare sort of the foundation of their life. And then it becomes about, okay, so what can you do for yourself now? Where can you be a little selfish? And so I think that's a huge point, is they're so focused on being the breadwinner, bringing home the money, supporting the kids and the wife, that they themselves are last on their own list, right? So I always tell them, if not right away, within the first couple weeks, can you carve out some me time, right? Me time is not not really understood, but so important for their hearts and their souls, because they work so hard. I feel they deserve that. And the stories are so big, right? Like they're here, but they're sending money home to Punjab, and you know, you just, that connection for their families and just everything. That's where the history is, right? And so trying to support that individual so he can then support X number of people, it's a life changer, you know. And I hear that a lot, right? So I think that's the biggest thing, is how do you balance what Sikhi teaches us, what we stand for, our values, with being really humbled by a disease that's really real, you know?
Okay, Parminder, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Just carrying on from Karanjit's points, I think, and Haji's point. I've been part of 2-3 different Bhangra teams, and what Bhangra gave me is a sense of belonging, a sense of direction, a sense of trying. You know, if you have the right Bhangra team around you, you know, or a right team of people around you, they guide you through the right actions. And then coming back to substance abuse, and what I've realized is, with what I said earlier, you know, Sikhs being recognized as a martial race, you know, you have this ego, this pride, this thing that we should be able to fix everything. It becomes a big pressure, you know, as you said, Karanjit, you know, sending money home to India, you know, looking after the wife, looking after the kids, looking after the extended family. Next, you know, is, you know, they forget to look after themselves. Then they turn to alcohol. Alcohol can only last for so long. Then they become numb to alcohol. Then they turn to substances like cocaine, heroin, marijuana, whatever it is. And after those things, both of those things don't work, they haven't turned to others to talk to because they're isolated. You know, Bhangra works as you have someone to turn to, you know, or any other sport or anything. You have a team around you to engage with. But those who are isolated because they work, then next minute, you know, is they're taking their own lives because they don't know where else to turn. And this is a sad state of a community that's been taken down this road, as Gurjit mentioned earlier, you know, this colonial pathway of saying we're soldiers, forgetting that before that we were actually people who were humble, who were compassionate, kind, and they only took to the sword when they had to defend not only themselves but others for their righteousness. You know, and what we have now currently is our own identity given to us by those who wanted to use us, and somehow we have to break away from that and regain and redefine our original identity, and hopefully that will then save our own people. You know, so Bhangra's there, you know, wrestling, which is part of our fraternity, kabaddi, there's a whole load of things, gatka, but we seem to be forgetting those, and we've tagged onto this thing that we're a martial race, but we were never always a martial race. That came at the end. So yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. It's just I had to add that.
You make an important point, Parminder, because Bhangra is not just about the exercise, it's also about the belongingness, as you rightly point out. And that's what uplifts your self-esteem when you feel it's not simply the exercise. You could go to a gym and do exercise, but the Bhangra is like a sense of belonging. And when it reinforces your identity, you feel that you're a part of something that gives you confidence. And the other thing that you talk about is that if we don't have a very strong identity, we're simply puppets being manipulated left, right, and center. And most of us, we don't even know who is playing those strings, right?
No.
Yeah. Okay, so Shuranjit, what's your take on it? Because I know you have an interest in health as well. So in terms of our, you know, the links between our health and well-being and our identity, what is your take on that?
Yeah, so just going back to what you mentioned about, you know, how it's very easy to become in a state where people become puppets and, you know, you don't know who's doing the manipulating. And that's why, for me, that kind of critical consciousness of being able to question power and try and understand how power functions in our society, understand who holds power, who's being denied power, which decisions are being made because of people holding power and others being marginalized. Having the skills to be able to kind of understand those situations is absolutely key for how we engage with the world more widely. You know, if we're thinking about how we want to continue and really, you know, even just attempt to continue the work that was started when Guru Nanak Dev Ji were born, we need to be conscious of power. You know, they were fundamentally conscious of especially things like caste. We need to be fundamentally conscious of how we are both people who experience oppression, but we're also people who oppress others.
Mhm.
You know, we are people who have biases, have prejudices, but when we acknowledge and when we reflect on that, then we can slowly start taking steps towards finding that balance. And that balance isn't always going to come straight in front of us. You know, it's never actually, you know, this is my belief, is that very few people actually achieve that balance. Everyone's just working towards that balance. And so being conscious about power and accepting that, you know, we're all imperfect, but we're all continually learning is a really, really core part of this whole conversation for me. And just because we experience oppression doesn't mean that we can't oppress others. And so, you know, that's just something that I think is very important in this, because if we aren't able to locate power, if we aren't able to locate injustice, then we can very easily become puppets. We can very easily become people who are manipulated to actually seek the means of others. And so, yeah. Oh, I see Parminder's got his hand back up. I can jump onto the health stuff after Parminder's come in, so it's all good.
Go ahead, Parminder.
I was just going to say, Sharonji, I totally agree. This whole thing, it's a fine line of being oppressed and being the oppressor. You know, it's like, you know, saying, you know, on brand, I can't be a racist, but actually you can be a racist. You know, it's yeah, I totally agree. That's the reason why I put my hand up. I thought, you know, you hit the nail on the head, because we forget our responsibility to others, and you know, we're so busy entwined in our own issues and saying, oh, it was me, I suffered this, I'm still suffering, and then we forget the suffering of others. So I was just put my hand up just to say, yeah, spot on. I totally agree.
Yes, and Sharanjit was also talking about the hierarchies. So it's about cultural hegemony based on where we are positioned in that hierarchy. And in a way, it's not even about race. It's also about what we perceive to be more valuable. Like, for example, in terms of beauty, we know that culturally, we still believe that those who are fairer skinned are more beautiful than those who are darker skinned. We still, you know, even though not everyone will admit it, we know that that's what goes on, you know, and when people are trying to kind of arrange marriages and whatever, we know that that still goes on. And that's within the context of, we know about equality, we believe in equality, and yet we still put people in hierarchies of who's more beautiful based on, you know, random things like that, like the color of their skin or the size of their eyes or the size of their nose or whatever it is. So it's about recognizing our own oppressions as well, I suppose, isn't it? Does anybody else have anything to add to anything that Sharanjit or Karanjit have said? Josh, what's your take on it? Because I know you have an interest in health as well, and this whole kind of complexity of like power and oppression and identities and how it relates to health.
No, well, I agree with what everyone else has had said. In terms of mental health, is a kind of stress that always runs in Asian culture. You know, I think we're always focusing about family, our kids, you know, marrying them off, etc. But we tend to forget about ourselves. But I think we need more of our Sikhi awareness, especially for the younger generation. You know, we need to bring them back on the path of knowing the great things about Sikhi and keeping us listening to the Bani, you know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so you know,
yeah. Two important points there, Josh. One is, you know, the concept of nam japo. You know, that's a fundamental principle. If we on a daily basis, if we have that in mind, that we're going to meditate, and therefore, I think maybe we can avoid becoming puppets if we're aligned. We know exactly who we are surrendering to, who we are willing to be servants of. So we make that choice. We make the choice of like who we want to be the master of our, you know, our purpose, I suppose. And the second thing is about creativity. It's like when your grandparents came to England, when my parents came to England, when my parents came to England, I know your grandparents came to England even before that, like that was, mine came in the 60s. Now, they didn't have time for hobbies because first generation immigrants, you know, they have to work really hard to simply feed their family. You know, you have to like, that has to be your main priority, is simply putting a roof over the family's head. And so no time for hobbies whatsoever. And that's, you know, it takes like the second generation or third generation to have the luxury of having their survival needs met. So then they can start thinking about their creative pursuits. And because I think that's one of the things that in my experience, we're not focusing enough on our creative expression, which is the well-being things, you know, the things that we do simply because it's pleasurable. Like traveling.
I agree with yourself, Jasveer, and especially with my one thing that really frustrates myself is being Sikhi, and it's not much of like, you know, and even our forgetting, you know, saying to Gore who we are, explaining to them about Sikhi, but even in our own community is kind of that separation's happened. Now I find that when I go to Gurdwaras in Scotland and Glasgow, because there's many more, even with our own, you know, Sangat people in there, doesn't really say Sastrikal or blah, you know, each other as much. It's very, you're just gone in there and you're going to do your own darshan, have your langar, and then we're really people that are like standing back now from mixing with our own community groups. So I think that's where the lack of the awareness, where we're not really standing strong as Sikhi with our values, and that's where it's kind of taken up on life, where we're impressing others now rather than impressing ourselves.
That's right. I lived in London for a long time, and I think like that experience you've talked about, where you go to the Gurdwara and you do your matha, and no one knows who you are, no one's you. That was my experience in London, and that's why I love going to the Gurdwara in Stafford, because those are the people that have seen me from the age of 5, you know, seen me grow up, and they know who my parents were, they know who my brothers and sisters are, and there I feel a sense of belonging. So even going to the Gurdwara, you have to feel that you belong for it.
You belong in that, in this sangha, and that's what it is. I mean, because it's harder for us, you know. It's okay for our elder generation, you know, our grandparents, etc., because they've got that, you know, more of well established in the community. But for younger, you know, we're losing out on I feel on our community in terms of all this, and we're just focusing on others, or either focusing on our own life. And this is where people are going on to alcohol, drugs, you know, going on different things where they're losing the values of Sikhi.
Yeah, and it's not very often that I have the opportunity to have intellectual conversations like this, where I don't have to explain what mathatik means.
Or even in terms of some people even shy of greeting someone by saying Sastrikal to someone, you know, or Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Some people hesitate to even say that. And then you look at other communities of beliefs, and they're saying in their, like the Muslim community, they're, long as they know that, yes, you both speak the same language, they're going to greet you in that thing. But we shy away from that, and I don't understand why. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm more of a person, like, even though I'm Monna, you know, without a dastar, turban, whatever. But I'm still, you know, I'm very strong into that, because if I'm going to meet another Sikh person, you know, I would want to greet them in the right way that we've been taught how to greet people.
Well, I can answer that question, Josh. The reason they don't, you know, they're reluctant to do that is because they want to fit in. So you see,
Yeah.
there's that kind of the conflict between, do we want to fit in or do we want to belong? And most people at my places of work, they don't even call me Jasveer, they call me Jesveer. They
Yeah.
call me Jesveer because they want me to fit in, even though these are.
It's even like myself with my name Josh. Yes, that's on my passport and birth certificate, but that's my middle name. My first name is Hardik. But we do that just for, you know, for getting a job, or just for, you know, your name on your CV where people struggle to pronounce it and make a laugh out of it.
That's right. Yeah. So any other views on this whole thing about belonging? What do we do to fit in? What is it that, you know, all of us here are in the Western world. We're living in communities where we're not the majority. So what is it that we are giving up in trying to fit in? What does it take to create spaces where we feel that we belong?
We just need to, I think we've got to bring our community back together, unless, you know, change the committee members in our Gurdwara, probably take, you know, getting the elder generation to maybe take a back seat and let the younger community voice their opinions, you know, to bring this, you know, to educate us. I mean, like, you know, I was speaking to earlier this week, I had a meeting and they were with some one of my people that we network with, and they're Pakistani people, and they were mentioning about Guru Nanak Dev Ji and things like that in Pakistan and this, and they said you should visit Pakistan and etc. But I didn't know too much about our Guru Nanak Dev Ji for me to also say 2-3 extra lines, which actually made me feel bad after the meeting, to say, well, I couldn't even, you know, add 2-3 extra where I can say, yes, I'm also aware of this, that. So I think in terms of, you know, we need to do a lot, I feel like.
I feel for you, Josh, because I'm exactly the same.
Yeah, because it makes me feel emotional, to be honest. I actually feel really upset about it, because, you know, you're just like, and then you look at other religions and they're so strong about it, even the younger kids and etc. like that. They know so much about their beliefs, and they don't want to lose that bloodline. They don't want to be marrying Goria, black people, Chinese. They want to keep that in their blood, because, you know, they're very strong about it.
I have to admit, sorry, Parminder, I will come to you, but I just have to say that it was quite late in life that I realized that Guru Nanak Dev Ji was born in what is now Pakistan. I didn't even know, you see. Somebody had to tell me that, and it was like, it would be too embarrassing for me to admit how recently that was. Parminder, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just coming back to the point that you said about identity. I think what we get is, it's a sad state we have, which is that we are driven by this need of generating as much income as we can, because we have to send money back, or we have to prove that we're as wealthy as the next person, or whatever it is. And because of that drive, we forget the essence of who we are. In addition to that confusion that was created by the British Empire upon us, where they how can I say, they drove our identity to suit them. And then the other bit we have is, if you know, if we compare ourselves, you know, like, you know, most people compare themselves to the Muslim community, and they say, oh, they push their agenda. Actually, they do and they don't. They understand where they come from and they present it well. What we tend to do is say, we're different from the Muslims. We're willing to conform, and we're not willing to present ourselves. And but then I think, we don't need that much education. We don't need that much education to present. But what we do need is enough to say, this is us, this is our history, this is how we connect to everyone else. And the rest is up to them. So of recent, before I used to just call myself Parminder or Parma or do something, but now everywhere I work, I ensure I put this, sing Parminder. I may not have a pug, I may not have a beautiful dari, I may not amritari, but I need to present the fact that I am from this community, and to start the dialogue, and then through the dialogue have debate, and through debate get to a position that I walk away learning something from someone else and they walk away learning something from me. And that's it.
Excellent. That's exactly the whole purpose of why we're doing this. Exactly what you've said, Pravinder. Sharanjit, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just on that topic of, building ourselves, building our communities, etc., etc. Yeah, there's a great imbalance in the PR work we do externally compared to the work that we do internally. So, there are not enough resources put into, Sikh-related classes within Godore, thinking about different kinds of educational resources, different organizations that can help support this work properly. But then we put resources into like turban tying on politicians, or like having events at Parliament and all that kind of thing, and expressing how like adaptable and how model minority we are. And in reality, that's just playing into the game, someone else's chessboard, right? And it's very, very important that we actually question where we're putting these types of resources, because at the end of the day, someone tying a dastar on a politician who might with one hand be taking a picture and the other hand be marginalizing parts of our society, is that what we want? We might get a great photo op, we might get 100 150 likes on Facebook or something, but at the end of the day, that is not serving the people who we're here to serve. And so when we engage with people, when we're engaging with power, we actually need to really, really be conscious of that. And when we're thinking, we might be thinking, are we playing someone else's game? We need to start playing this game in a different way. We haven't written the rules for that game. We're still playing someone else's game. We're learning the rules and we're just playing that same game. And so we don't want to be in that position where we're trying to challenge power and then just become the people who oppress. And so you don't want to return back around, and you don't want to just continue the game as it's been playing for so long, because we've been given different kinds of rules, and we've been given rules that go beyond the thinking of many people around us. And so for me, it comes back down to that. And so focusing inwards, focusing on ourselves, and then also on our communities, rather than performing, rather than pandering, rather than finding that proximity to people in power who have long pushed us down and long will push others down, even if we're standing by their side.
Sharanjit, your concept of model minority, I agree with you that we do seem to be putting a lot of effort into being a model minority. And the reason I say that is because there is a report which is published every year by Sikhs, the Sikh report, I think it's called. And in the Sikh report, one of the writers for it, she said that the Sikhs are the community that contribute the most to the GDP in Britain, but yeah, we contribute the most, but in terms of representation in management and leadership, we're not represented. I work in Birmingham, and all around me, and I know Sharanjit, you're familiar with Birmingham as well. In terms of representation in management and leadership, we're very poorly represented. I work at a university where in terms of Sikh representation in senior management, there's one person, and it's like this community has been in this area for 60 years. Why is it that only one person has become a dean, in decades? So,
but then, sorry, just to jump in, for me, it's not even just a thing about representation, because we can have all the Sikh politicians in power, but they can still be oppressing people.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's not about, it might have been about representation in the past, but it's not about representation now. It's not about what people look like. It's about what people do. And so for me, you know, this and you know, it's fine. We need people who actually are working through a Sikhi-based value system, through a Sikhi-based framework. And so when we're talking about what we want to see moving forwards, you know, we need to be questioning the rule book. We need to be really, really thinking outside the box. And you know, just having more Sikh politicians doesn't mean anything.
I think you've made an important
I think
point.
also,
Go ahead, Parminder. Go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I also think that we need to have a conviction and a willingness to deviate, to move away from what has been, as Sharanjit said, you know, we become politicians, we become a dean, we become a partner at PwC or whatever it is, and we present ourselves, and you know, this is Mr. Singh at this level or Mrs. Kaur at this level, but we don't make a change, we don't engage or educate. So I think it's time for us to actually say, look, it's time to deviate away from what has been given to us, and what the guidebook, as Charanjit says, the rules that we have to confine, and make our own rules and challenge and be the Sikhs that we're supposed to be, going back on the path of learning. And path of learning, you know, to learn also requires people to question. And I think we've stopped questioning. Yeah.
What I was going to say, yes, in alignment with what you're saying, is that I agree with you, Sharanjit, that it's not about representation at the racial level or ethnic level. It's more about representation at the level of values. Are our values being represented? Are our needs being accounted for?
And that is the question that gets lost in the conversation about representation. Because we think representation means, oh, this person looks like me. Oh, this person, you know, looks like my partner or whatever. But it's not about that. People can change their appearance. Anyone can change their appearance. Anyone can be made to look like someone else. But when it comes to values and actions, these are things that require specific outputs, change. It requires deviation. It requires thinking about things differently. And so if we're wedded to what people look like, we're opening ourselves up to manipulation again. So we need to be wedded to what people's actions are, what are they doing, how are they working on themselves, how are they working with the world around them, and how are they holding themselves accountable as well.
I think also it's sure to echo what you were saying. It's also to say, someone wearing a turban, having a long beard, and having a kirpan is not necessarily representative of a Sikh if their actions are aligned to how they present themselves. And we have individuals out there who are from a Sikh background and probably are doing a lot more seva, a lot more representation of how Sikh should be, just because they don't have a turban and beard. And I think what we end up getting stuck is this outward appearance, and it becomes this cloak, this costume, rather than, as Sharanjit says, our intentions, our actions, our values, and we get lost. You know, it's that, when are you going to take Amrit? When are you going to grow a beard? When are you going to have a turban? When are you going to stop eating meat? When are you going to stop drinking alcohol? When are you going to be, you know, all these things. Yeah. So if I was to do all those things, and Josh, you, me, Bal, all of us were supposed to do all those things, does that make us Sikhs? You know, and one of the things I said recently to a cousin of mine who's a Sikh, and saying, you know, oh, you eat meat, and I said, look, someone who eats meat and someone who doesn't eat meat, both of them commit murder. Who's a better murderer? The one who eats meat or one who eats vegetables? They're both committing murder. It's the actions. It's not the presentation of how it looks. So yeah, you know, I think it's about time that we start, you know, coming back to Sharanjit, presenting our values, presenting our intent. You know, growing up with the Muslim community in Aston, in Birmingham, I learned a lot about Islam, and you know, they always talked to, you know, when I used to sit down, they always talked about intent. You know, if your intentions are good, whatever the outcome is, the outcome. But if, as long as your intentions are pure, and we have the same core in us in Sikhi, you know, we try, but we don't outwardly present that. We're willing to conform quicker than we are to challenge. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Harji?
Yeah, I just wanted to add how refreshing it is to hear people from the Sikh community talk in this way, because certainly just speaking from my personal experience, me trimming my dadi created such a backlash in my community, especially coming from, these populations where, the physical appearance was much more important than where the value is expressed, right? And the person that I was, the values that I endorsed or advocated for in my day-to-day life and my career weren't looked at, and instead it was, how are you presenting yourself physically? So that's one point I wanted to make. But the other was, I think it's great that we're recognizing that values are important within these people that hold power, but I'd also wager to say that, that goodwill isn't enough, because I think people are corrupted by power and their values can change over time. I think instead we need to create incentive systems, social systems that, financially and socially are going to drive them to continue to take action that's going to help these marginalized communities, right? I think then, rather than just depending on someone to do the right thing and hoping that once they're in a position of power, they'll continue doing those things, we are creating systemic change that is pushing them constantly in that direction. And I don't think a lot of our systems today are capable of pushing in that manner.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much. Karanjit?
I was just going to say the same thing about appearance. I think it's really, one of the things I notice in my work is loki ki akhange. That's a huge thing, right? I can't get help because loki ki akhange. I can't, XYZ. I can't even get people in the door because they're nervous about who's going to see them. And, when I see them, we have privacy, HIPAA, so many things in place. And so of course I'm not going to say anything, but the first thing they say to me is make sure you don't tell anybody that I'm here to get treatment, right? It's like what Harji said about appearances. It's all about that society and what people are going to perceive. So it's almost like before your own well-being, lokan da khayal kar lo, and apni bach, like we're secondary to that thing, like that society. And it's such a bizarre thing because I grew up with it. Like, my parents came from India in the late 70s. My dad came. So the generation I'm in, born and raised in Canada, like it was always about pleasing society, right? Like kuri doctora, blah, 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 right? The story goes on. And changing that dialogue for the next generation. So for my kid, for example, I catch myself, I think about what something she does sometimes, or what are people, you're outside, what are people going to think? It's a really funny thing because it's 40 years in the making for me. And so how do you change the dialogue, and I think that speaks to some of, the sort of core values of Sikhi, and then what, the culture teaches us. It's very different. It's like the whole caste thing, right? If you look at Sikhi and values, this is not part of that, but yet we carry that. You go back to Punjab today and you have Majbi Singh and you have all these denominations, right? And Appa Jatta and this and that, and it just the story goes on. But the point is that we are very focused on people and society and what we look like to them, right? More than ourselves sometimes, right? So that's, I just wanted to say that.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Parminder, go ahead.
Yeah, I was smiling and laughing because the irony of the situation, we the Sikh community came about to be different, to present ourselves different.
Yeah.
Hence the pug and the dari, to stand aside from the crowd and as I said, the good values and everything. And now
we're dying in.
Exactly. This is it. So yeah, currently, I totally get it. And the Haji is what he's saying. He's being challenged for changing his appearance, but trying to be good internally. And yeah, it's just, yeah, I just find the whole thing ironic. Yeah, that's what it was.
Okay, Baljinder, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as much as I agree with Chiranjeev and Parminder about good intention and not just having representation just for the looks of it, I almost think that you need a seat on the table before you actually make any changes as well, especially in the modern world. You know, if you want to change politics, if you want to change systems and laws, you kind of like need to have a position of power, if that makes sense. I'm quite conflicted because I agree with both of you as well. So that was one point. And I think one of the earlier points about having a good sangat, you know, Sikhi teaches that. So whether you're in a Bhangra team, a rugby team, a football team, as long as you have a good bunch of people around you that are, you know, promoting and sharing a positive message, then yeah, you've hit jackpot in life. So yeah.
I was just going to say, Bal, you know, having a seat at the table doesn't necessarily mean having a seat at the table. It's about influencing power, influencing change. And you can do that without having a seat at the table, because sometimes having a seat at the table, you then get conflicted and possibly corrupted. But having an inroad to influence, having an engagement with those that hold power to sway them in a way of thinking better, not just for us, but everyone, I think is more practical than just having a seat at the table, because then we're only as good as or as powerful as while we hold that seat. Once that seat goes, you know, the power goes. Whereas the influence, you could always continue. You can always carry on engaging. So I get what you're saying, but yeah, I think it's more for me personally, it's more about how do we influence rather than how do we get the seat. But then I suppose it's a bit of, to influence, you need to have some level of engagement at that seat.
In an ideal world, you'd have both, wouldn't you, Pamela? You'd have a seat at the table and you'd have the influence. So you need both of them. You don't really.
That's just being greedy.
I was going to ask Josh, because Josh, you are somebody who's created your own seat at the table. That's what entrepreneurs do. And you being entrepreneurial, do you think that you would be as successful as you are now if you were part of an organization, Josh?
It depends, but like, so can I just get a wee bit more understanding in terms of what you mean by this?
Because what I notice, you know, I work with leaders and managers, and what I notice is that some managers, they get to this kind of ceiling where they know they're not ever going to get to those you know, the real decision-making jobs, and the only way out for them from that is to set up their own organization, to set up their own freelancing work or their own enterprise, to become entrepreneurial. That's the only way they can get around this, that ceiling, you know, the concrete ceiling that we talk about. What do you think about that? You know, and these are people, the reason I'm asking you this question is that it's not that they don't have the leadership skills or the management skills, because they obviously do, because when they set up their own organization, they're very successful.
I agree, but it takes, obviously, it does take a lot, you know, to become an entrepreneur or, you know, into that level of position. And yeah, so I mean, with myself running my own organization, it comes with leadership skills and managing, you know, people and kind of being that leader, but not just having the chair just to say I'm the director of the company. I mean, because when things go in the wrong way, you know, you're responsible of all the actions that happens. So yeah, so I agree.
The reason I asked that question, sorry, Karanjit, I'll come back to you. The reason I asked that, the second reason I asked that question is because going back to that earlier point when I was talking about the British Sikh report that is published, where they talk about how Sikhs are overrepresented in terms of how much we contribute to the GDPR. And I think that is because so many of our community have become entrepreneurs, you know, they have their own businesses. So that means they're able to contribute a lot more. Whereas if they stayed in organizations where they felt stifled, where they felt oppressed, and there was no kind of, you know, way to be successful fulfill their potential, they wouldn't be top contributors.
Mhm. It's all about, it's about willingness in terms of having, like with myself, I mean, I started up the business like, when I was quite younger than what the age that I am now. And I think, sometimes, like they say, age is just a number. Some people can get put off by thinking, oh, you're only young or you're old or whatever. But you got to have that mindset and that passion and drive to actually to do it, to be a doer rather than just talking about it and no actions. So I think in myself, I've always been that type of person where if I've said something, I would do it. I would actually execute and make that change, make that drive happen, make something work, rather than just people just saying that, oh, I'm the secretary of whatever, or like in our Gurdwara committee, being a pardhan or whatever. Some people just take it for the badge holder and actually don't do nothing on making that change. But with myself, is where you want to be. So in terms of running a business, is where how far do you want to go? Like they say, sky's the limit. So that's how I take it on to myself.
Okay, great. Well, this has been a very inspiring conversation. Does anybody have any final points, anything else that they would like to say before we close?
Hi, yeah, just a quick words before Sharanjit says anything. I think, yeah, so we started off with leadership, our community, but it's a fine line. Josh talking about entrepreneurship, you talking about the Sikh report and the GD part, our contribution to the gross domestic product. Yeah, it's fine line that we don't get lost in our egos to say we need to be leaders, we need to be at the table, we need to be, let's go back, even if we're not at the table, even if we're not leaders, but we're doing the things that we can to make better our people and those around us in the community. I think that's a greater achievement than the leadership element. So I think it's just about saying, let's be mindful. If we're going to be looking at leadership, let's look at leadership in the whole essence of how it impacts on us and those around us, and not just get lost in how do we get to becoming leaders and ruling and everything else, because otherwise we get lost in the ego. But I'll pass you on to Sharanjit.
Sorry, just to interrupt. Sorry about that. But it's just like you need a team, like in terms of being leaders. Yes, it is always one, but you also need supporters as well. You need a bit of both, I think.
I think that we're looking at a power structure again. A leader, a supporter. Why not having equal? We can all learn from each other. Everyone becomes something at one point because their skill set. I know we live in a world of titles. I tend to walk away from whenever I go into companies, they say, "What do you want to be known as?" I go, "Call me whatever you want. I'm not really bothered. I'll get the job done." I've sat in companies where I had to represent the chief exec, but my title was coordinator. I really don't care, and I think that's what it comes down. If people can see you for who you are, rather than looking at your calling card, your business card, your title. Recently, I told a young person that anyone can be a chief exec. All you have to do is go on to company's house and set up a company and call yourself chief exec.
Agreed.
That's it. But I think the proof is in the pudding. And one last bit I got to say is, whatever we do now, it's going to be forgotten by the next generation. Once we die, we've gone. I think the only legacy we leave is the legacy of how we influence our children and those in our family to continue the good work that we do now. So I'll pass you over to Sharanjit.
Yeah, that's what's called culture. Culture is what we pass to the next generation, isn't it? Go ahead, Sharanjit.
Yeah, just to kind of go back to a couple of those main points we were talking about when we were talking about representation, and even yourself bringing up the report, even when we're talking about contribution, these aren't ends in and of themselves. These are potential means to an end. If we get fixated on, oh, we've got this X and Y and Z person in this position, this isn't the outcome. this should be the facilitator, or could be one of the facilitators to achieving an outcome that is more aligned with ourselves and our Sikhi. And when I'm thinking about that, it's related to achieving equity and actually readdressing some of the inequalities and social hierarchies in our society. And so even when we're talking about contribution, that is a stick that is then used to beat other communities. You know, just because Sikhs might provide or contribute within when it comes to GDP, it's very, that whole argument is then used to say, oh, but these migrant communities don't provide in that way. These people aren't contributors. When in reality, you know, when we're thinking about things around aspiration, is it that we want to be contributors? Do we want people to become entrepreneurs and the next, I don't know, Jeff Bezos, whose workers get absolutely, you know, mistreated in many, many different ways? Is it that we want that? For me, that's not the future I see. And so the question is, how are we thinking about these things as a means to an end rather than an end in itself?
That's right. And it goes back to what you said earlier about being the model minority. It's like here, you know, the latest race report that they did, that's very controversial. That's basically what they've said. Well, there's obviously no racism because this community is doing really well compared to that community. So, so Karanjit, you're probably not aware of that, but we had a race report commissioned by the government in light of all the pandemic, the overrepresentation of some communities in the people who died, and which exposed structural inequalities. And the race report basically said there is no racism because some communities are doing really well. And so that is just confirmation of what Shuranjit's just been saying. Is there anybody? Yeah. Is there anybody else who wants to say something before we close?
No, this is a wonderful platform. I really appreciate everyone's viewpoints. It's been very fascinating. Thank you.
Likewise, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for your time and your sharing and your generosity. And this is only one conversation out of many, hopefully. Like this leadership project, I envisage it to be going on for several years. And, you know, hopefully we will have another discussion like this soon at your convenience.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you there.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you.
And you as well,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.